without further ado, to business. I would like to call Professor Haridimos Tsoukas to introduce the keynote speaker. Thank you, Harry.
Thank you, Jota. Dear colleagues, dear friends, good morning. Welcome to EGOS 2015 in Athens. A couple of years ago, an undergraduate student of mine in the business department came to my office and said to me, "You know something, Professor? I've been reading philosophy, and I find that philosophy is profoundly practical. I need to tell you that this was a business studies student. And at the University of Cyprus, we require our undergraduates to take 4 courses from other faculties. So he chose to study philosophy. And he came back fascinated. Philosophy is a profoundly practical matter. I was fascinated myself to hear a young man, 21 years old, recognize exactly this point, that philosophy is not about abstractions. Philosophy is about how to live. Now, I said to him, "Have you read Alexander Nehamas' work, particularly his book, The Art of Living?" He said no, and he went out to start reading it. So the philosophy that Alexander Nehamas espouses, the kind of philosophy he does, is not so much about the technical abstractions. It is about philosophy as the art of living. So I want to share some thoughts with you so that you can appreciate better his thinking and to help prepare the ground for his talk. I would paraphrase, I came across his book, The Art of Living, a few years back, and I would paraphrase it as, if you like, the art of becoming an individual. It is the art of cultivating yourself intellectually, aesthetically, so that you can find your own voice and make your individual imprint on the world. I think this is, in effect, and I hope I'm not distorting, a central message of his book. So for him, philosophy is not so much a technical subject. Philosophy is about how one to live, what sort of person one wants to be. When in an interview a few years back, when he was asked by the interviewer to identify why does he think that the world should be treated like a text, why should we be paying attention to aesthetics, he answered as follows: "I do believe that the features that characterize oneself and one's life are similar to the features of literary works. The virtues of life are comparable to the virtues of good writing, style, connectedness, grace, elegance, and also, we must not forget, sometimes getting it right." He describes himself as a cosmopolitan, and he writes, should he identify a group for whom he speaks, that group would be the closest, the philosophical cosmopolitans, as he calls them. Cosmopolitans, he notes, refuse to belong exclusively to a single place, to a single tribe, whether the tribe is a nation, a profession, or a discipline. "I think of myself," he notes, "as a cosmopolitan. To be a cosmopolitan is not to belong nowhere, it is to belong to many places." And then the interviewer comes back and says, "But you are a Greek American." And Alexander responds, "I am not a Greek American. I am a Greek and an American, and also a Spanish citizen, and a philosopher, and a critic. I like Proust, and television, and argument, interpretation, intelligence, sensibility." When he was, some of the themes that characterize the philosophy of Professor Nehamas, I would summarize some of them, not all of them, but as being concerned with contingency, possibility, imagination. So in that interview, for example, he talks about the power of contingency in life, to shape life. "If I had not gone to Swarthmore College when I did, if I had not run into Foucault when I did, if I hadn't been married, everything would be different. The art of living is turning your life into a coherent object, into something with style, whatever the recalcitrant facts, to weave everything into a pattern, a text. And about imagination, he knows as follows: I care about private life, but what people do privately is of great public significance, because eventually, one way or the other, it will affect the issues we identify, and public issues. How our income is going to be distributed, how can we secure some basic rights for everyone, how can we make sure that children do not starve. The worst, the most difficult thing that affects us as people is the failure of the imagination. We don't realize that various things are possible, which is to say that we don't realize that everything is contingent, that things could be different. So when Alexander Nehamas talks about philosophy, it is philosophy in that sense. He wants to cultivate that inquisitive mind, the reflective attitude, the aesthetic appreciation, which is to cultivate ultimately individuality. But he also has something, he's cautious. He wants to teach the Socratic message and connect with other messages. But at the same time, he makes the following comments when he's asked about how the Socratic message can be lived by people who manage other people, or who manage affairs of the state. So he notes, Socrates was concerned with himself above all else. Athens came second. By contrast, those who take care of the affairs of the state won't be able to think too much about themselves. Buses won't go, sewers won't run, welfare checks will not be written out, national defense will fail if political leaders are Socratic individuals. You cannot have a Socratic society. Leaders are Socratic individuals. You can't have a Socratic society, and yet a society with no Socratics is a deficient society. I like the complexity of the argument. To be a practically oriented person, to exercise authority and power in the modern world is to do so reflectively. There is a Socratic moment, but at the same time, the person who lives a Socratic life is not the ideal person necessarily to run the affairs of the state. Now, this is the spirit that Alexander Nehamas has been, in which he has written most of his work. He is a professor of philosophy and literature at Princeton University, where he did his PhD. First, when he went to the States, when he left Athens to go to the States, he studied at Swarthmore College. He did his PhD under Gregory Vlastos, the well-known classicist, and then he has been teaching at Princeton since 1990. Alexander, we are delighted, honored, and proud to have you in Athens, an Athenian back in Athens. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Grateful, deeply grateful as I am for this invitation. I am thinking of Admiral James Stockdale, whom no one here knows, I think. Admiral Stockdale was the vice presidential candidate for Ross Perot's presidential campaign in America in 1992. Nobody knew who he was until the day that he appeared for a public interview, and he began the interview by saying, "I'm asking myself, what am I doing here?" This is the question I'm asking myself. I do hope that by the end, you will not go away asking that question about me. So I'll start right away. We live in a time during which the language and rhetoric of morality are on the verge of taking over the full range of human relations. Collectively, nations and other groups commonly justify their policies, to which moral notions are not primarily applicable, on moral grounds. That limits the range of accommodations and compromises that are crucial to politics and allows each side in any debate to represent themselves as morally superior to their opponents, and their opponents in turn see them as hypocrites and think of themselves as the only supporters of truth and goodness. Just watch the public rhetoric in our country at this very moment. You'll see that is exactly what is happening. Individually, perhaps more in the United States, but gradually in the rest of the world as well, even personal interactions are becoming subject to moral description and evaluation. The rise of what we call professional ethics in politics, in medicine, business, law, and university life is one among many sad indications that we are unable to envisage standards of proper behavior that, unless they are enforced by means of explicit rules and detailed sanctions. The oxymoronic concept of ethics laws, which address not only what is legal within an institution, but also what counts as decent or proper, and sometimes simply what accords with etiquette and what doesn't, is now part of everyday life. Many believe that rules and principles should govern even the most intimate personal relations, relations among family members, lovers, friends, and believe that the only values that determine whether a life is worth living or not fall within the domain of morality. Now, I'm not against morality. I think that the moral ideal and the equal of impartiality and the equal treatment of everyone is a great accomplishment of modernity, and the idea of human rights would never have secured its far from perfect hold on our imagination without the sense that something essential ties each one of us to our species as a whole, and our well-being to the well-being of our species as a whole. But that attitude can't be appropriate to all the human relationships that we are engaged in. The values of morality are the values of our commonality. They're grounded in our similarities to one another and the fact that we're all human and aspire to the fair treatment of everyone. But they're not the only values there are. There are also values that are grounded in our differences and aspire to independence and individuality. Values that prize one's own particular way of doing things. We must acknowledge the fact that many factors on which we depend for understanding and evaluating each other are not moral, which is not to say that they are necessarily immoral either. Contemporary philosophy, too, has focused primarily on moral values and general rules. And the abstractness of our substantive concerns is reflected in the impersonality of much philosophical writing, writing that is modeled on the scientific paper and the legal brief, forms that are suited to detached investigation and aim at suppressing the personality of their author. But this is not the only self-image philosophy has had of itself. In ancient Greece and Rome, philosophy was considered, and considered itself, not only as a theoretical or investigative discipline, but also as a discipline for life. And at this point, I must say that after hearing Professor Tsoukas' introduction, I feel that I have nothing new to say. He said it all so well. From Socrates to Boethius, from Plato to Plotinus, philosophy was primarily an art of living, a techni to view, as it was known. Naturally, the ancient philosophers, like the contemporary, like their present-day descendants, engaged in the investigation of abstract issues. They produced complicated arguments. One session in your conference, for example, I should say in our conference, is about Zeno's paradoxes, of all things, and they espoused complex theories. But that was only part of what they were concerned with. Unlike, say, merchants or engineers, philosophers were supposed to live according to the values that were consonant with the theoretical views. The purpose of their investigations was not merely to acquire knowledge, which is an important goal in its own right, of course, but more important, to live their life in harmony with the knowledge they had acquired. Such a conception of philosophy originates in part with Socrates. Socrates in what we call Plato's aporetic works. Aporetic because in them, Socrates, although he is convinced that the unexamined life is not worth living for a human being, is unable to convince others to join him in the pursuit of what he considers virtue and wisdom. When people again and again fight against his exhortations to live virtuously and to examine their lives and move off, Socrates can only stand helplessly by. Words fail him. He has no argument to ensure that everyone must agree that nothing, as he puts it, neither money, nor fame, nor honor, is more important than what he called the care of the self, epimelia erftu. He has a universalist ideal. By that I mean the idea that the life of virtue should be everyone's pursuit, but not a universalist method. He has no means to prove that others are logically obliged to follow his lead. In the Republic, however, Plato articulates a different view. He argues here that virtue can be pursued only as part of a more general pursuit, the pursuit of knowledge of the whole world, a pursuit he names for the first time in the history of the West, philosophy. And he also thinks that philosophy has sufficient resources to convince everyone that such a philosophic life is the best type of life that anyone can aspire to. His conception is universalist in both content, everyone should live that particular life, and method. Here are the arguments to show you why you should do that. In fact, he says that only if you live a life of virtue will you ever be happy. And although Plato's ancient successors often disagreed about what exactly the right philosophy is, in fact, they disagreed all the time about what the right philosophy is, they were at one with Plato in thinking that the life of the philosopher, the philosophic life, is the only path to virtue and happiness. But a different conception of Socrates, a different vision, rather, of Socrates' conception has emerged in the work of several modern thinkers, a conception that differs from ancient philosophy because it is not universalist, neither in content nor in method, and from modern philosophy because it is not simply theoretical. These authors' approach is, as I will call it, individualist. They are philosophical individualists. They believe that philosophy provides them with their own ideal life, but concede that life can take many forms, none of which is ideal for everyone. They hold that no particular set of values, moral or any other sort, determines how everyone should live, and they refuse, for that reason, to articulate in general terms what a good life should be. Now, that may very easily sound as a kind of relativism. My way of life is good for me, your way of life is good for you, and let's just forget about discussing it. But philosophical individualism is not relativistic. It doesn't claim that any life is as good as any other, only that no single human life is best for everybody. In that regard, philosophical individualism is what I will call aestheticist. Its model is art. Why art? Why go there? Because, to begin with, art is pluralistic without being relativistic. There is a contrast here between art and any situation in which the goal is to establish a factual claim, whether in everyday or in scientific contexts. Our goal in these situations is to find the one right answer to our question, reach a consensus, and move on to a next one. The goal in these disciplines that pursue the right account is convergence and unity. We all need to come to the same conclusion. It is not that way with art. We can't even begin to imagine such a thing as what the ideal painting or the ideal novel or the ideal opera is, and which, once established, just like a scientific theory, will make all the other theories that have preceded it will completely pass them over. On the contrary, what we prize in the arts is the opportunity to envisage a new way of dealing with the world, whether it's with line or color or words or musical notation. We want the generation of a new movement, of new movements all the time that add to our repertory without, for that reason, reducing the value of what has preceded. In art, we welcome the multiplication of possibility, the invention of a new manner, a new way of doing things. In the sciences, discovery and innovation are supposed to bring us closer to the truth. That is, the guiding metaphor of science, is the approach to the truth. In the arts, there's nothing to get closer to. What Aristotle once said about virtue may be true of the sciences. There are, he said, many ways of being wrong, but only one way of being right. In the arts, by contrast, there are many ways of being right, and discovering yet another is a great accomplishment. And so, I think, with life. There are many ways of living well, and establishing yet another, expanding, that is, the realm of human possibility, is a source of joy and admiration. And why exactly is this not relativism? Isn't it just to say that any form of life is as good as any other, that there are no standards that allow us to judge which among them is better and which is worse than others? And I answer, no, it isn't. Although it may be silly to ask who the greater painter in the world is, whether it's Raphael or Rembrandt or Manet, it's not at all silly to claim that, let me go to, it's perfectly reasonable to say that Rembrandt, whose portrait, or one of his portraits you see here, is a greater painter than Frans Hals, who is truly also a very great painter, but not as good as Rembrandt, or Jacob van Loo. All of them, you see three portraits of roughly the same kind of thing, and you can tell the difference between them. We also know that those three are vastly, vastly superior to the many millions of people, professional and amateur alike, who have tried their hand at a painting during the course of human history. That's another portrait of the same sort, but not nearly as admirable as the ones we saw before. And that includes the many thousands of people who devote their life to painting pictures or portraits of Elvis Presley on velvet. It's one of the most popular pastimes for bad painters in America. For all these, and many others, besides, all these things, including the velvet paintings, are art. But like most art, by far its greatest portion, its overwhelming majority, they're also terrible. And we have no trouble saying so. We might sometimes disagree about our orderings, but we do establish them. And we sometimes even reach agreement. Let me now quote from a marvelous passage from Nietzsche, from Friedrich Nietzsche, who's one of my great philosophers. He entitles it, "One thing is needful," and continues, "One thing is needful, to give style to one's character, a great and rare art. It is practiced by those who survey all the strengths and weaknesses of their nature and fit them into an artistic plan until every one of them appears as art and reason, and even weaknesses delight the eye. In the end, when the work is finished, it becomes evident how the constraint of a single taste governed everything, large and small. Whether this taste was good or bad is less important than you might think, if only it was a single taste." Style, I want to suggest to you, plays the same role in art and in life. I shouldn't say art and life, I should say art and the rest of life, because art is an essential part of life. It's not something that we can compare it with life in general. An artist's style is like a person's character. It unifies the works of some, of the one, and the actions of the other, and at the same time distinguishes each person who has a style from every other one who also has a style. It's a difficult thing to develop. Nietzsche writes that it requires long practice and daily work, but those who acquire it, he writes, enjoy their finest gaiety in such constraint and perfection under a law of their own. Gaiety in such constraint and perfection under a law of their own. Three things are important in this statement. First, notice, style is a constraint. It involves rules and practices we must learn to subject ourselves to and limit the number of choices we can make at any particular point. In limiting them, however, style makes choice possible in the first place, because the ability to choose anything is in the end identical with the ability to choose nothing. In fact, it's been shown very convincingly that one of the major causes of depression in contemporary society is the vast number of choices that are available to us. And you know, you go to the supermarket and you want to buy some cereal, and there are 80,000 different cereals. And what do? You lose your ability to choose at that point. There's so much that you can't choose between. Style is what allows you to choose what to do within a very particular, constrained set of possibilities. It is for that reason that some might consider style, or what Nietzsche calls the tyranny of its capricious laws. They consider that responsible for bad things. But Nietzsche says, no, it's the tyranny of such capricious laws that is responsible, he says, for all there is or has been on earth of freedom, subtlety, boldness, dance, and masterly sureness, whether in thought or in government or in rhetoric and persuasion, in art just as in ethics. It is a constraint that does not constitute a compulsion. It is, on the contrary, a prerequisite of freedom. And he continues, every artist knows how far from any feeling of letting himself go his most natural state is. The free ordering, placing, disposing, giving form at the moment of inspiration. And how strictly and subtly he obeys thousandfold laws precisely then, laws that exactly on account of their hardness and determination defy all formulation through concepts. Style, in other words, is not a compulsion, because to have a style is to have internalized its rules in such a way that the choices you make, the choices that it presents to us, are not dictated from the outside. They become inbred in us. We internalize them, and they become part and parcel of who we actually are. They simply are our way, our particular way of doing things. Instead of limiting our power to act, style makes action possible. The second thing to notice is that these rules, Nietzsche says, defy all formulation by concepts. What on earth does that mean? I think what it means is that they are, as Nietzsche says, laws of one's own. But what again is it to have laws that are one's own, laws that apply only to me? Why can't they be formulated through concepts? In part, I answer, because they are not rules that can be stated independently. We can't, so to speak, say, these are the rules, now go ahead and apply them. As we do with legal statutes or the laws of grammar. The laws are there, and we can tell whether we meet them or not. These rules determine, the rules of style, determine how we see the world in the first place. They structure our very awareness of our place in the world and the various possibilities of action that the world presents to us without having to be explicitly stated. In 1954 to 55, Picasso spent 4 months at one point making 15 paintings, countless drawings, and several lithographs inspired by Delacroix's painting, 2 paintings of the Algerian women. These are the 2 paintings of Delacroix. Why did Picasso do all those various versions of this painting? It was, part of his reason was to satisfy both sight and touch, to show what pure sight shows us one side of a person's surface, as in the figure on the left over there, and what touch allows us to feel different parts of the body at the same time as we see in the figure on the right, who seems to be lying, as far as Picasso is concerned. This is the painting. Look at the figure on the left. You just see her face facing you. The picture on the other on the right, you can see both the back and the breast of the same individual. And I'll show you some other ones. There it is, again on the right. Let's see. And there it is again. This is the last one, at the very bottom there. I know I can do this, but I can't point it. It's the lilac object on the right is a person represented in such a way that it's lying both on its stomach and on its back. And yesterday at the Archaeological Museum, I saw a statue, a sculpture of a woman lying down, and you could see both the front and the back. So what he's trying to do here is to make painting do, in a way, what sculpture does, is to show you everything about a person on all sides. Once he did that, he left that issue aside. He never painted another version of the Delacroix paintings and went on his own way. But the question whether and how this could ever be done didn't have an answer until he actually did it, until the picture seemed right to him and allowed him to leave it alone and go on to other things. In other words, there are no rules, so to speak, that Picasso followed to get there. Once he did it, we now know what those rules are, and we could apply them to our own work. But as I'll suggest in a minute, there are certain ways of applying rules that does not produce anything worthwhile. Finally, the third point, also connected with the expression, a law of one's own. Success in this sort of enterprise is measured by the nature of the difference between one's works or actions and everyone else's, by the extent to which they manifest, as Nietzsche would put it, a single taste. Style and character individuate. They constitute one's own way of doing things, one's own way of living. Art and life, or the rest of life, mirror each other once again. Artists, Nietzsche writes again, seem to have more sensitive noses in these matters, knowing only too well that precisely when they no longer do something voluntarily, but do everything of necessity, the feeling of freedom, subtlety, full power of creating, placing, disposing, and forming reaches its peak. In short, that the necessity and freedom of the will are one in them. What he has in mind here is the following. If you're trying, as you can see with Picasso, if you're trying still to accomplish something, you have choices. Do I go this way? Do I put my brush this way? Do I put a red spot here or a blue spot there? You ask yourself those questions. Once you internalize your style, you no longer ask those questions. You do it naturally. In that sense, it is necessary to do, but you're not compelled because it springs from within. It's not an external force that makes you act that way. We should learn from artists, Nietzsche writes, while being wiser than they are in these matters, in other matters. For with them, the subtle power usually comes to an end when art ends and life begins. But we want to be the poets of our life. And that, for him, is the same as to want to become, as he puts it, what one is. Human beings who are new, unique, incomparable, who give themselves laws, who create themselves. But to be new, unique, incomparable is for Nietzsche to be an individual. And that's a term that he comes to again and again. Now, such a goal, becoming an individual, is impossible to achieve, whether it is in art or life or anywhere else, by following instructions that are generally available. Rules that are not, to some extent or other, of one's own making and apply in their totality only to us. The reason for that is that an individual is just someone who differs significantly from the rest of the world. The difference must be significant because everyone is already an individual in a trivial sense. Since none of us has the same history as anyone else, no two people can ever be, strictly speaking, identical. But that is no accomplishment at all. Everybody is in that sense unique. And I used to hate it when my son was younger and I would take him to school in America, the first days of school, and we'd all get together and the teachers would come and say, oh, we're so grateful that you're giving us your children to educate. Each one is so unique. You must be so proud of it. And I was saying, no, I'm not at all proud of it. Why? I mean, of course, every child here is different, but it's not difference itself that makes the difference. It's significant difference. That's what we're after here. What deserves notice or praise is not difference in its own right, but being newly, importantly, strikingly, admirably, unexpectedly, also disturbingly, dangerously, perhaps even barbarically different from the rest of the world. Someone who, for one reason or another, stands out in comparison to whom the rest of the world is simply background. For better or worse, though, it is impossible to specify what counts as new, important, admirable, or barbaric in general terms. Terms like this can't be defined by general statements. There are no rules or laws that establish how one can become an individual. Submission to rules, in this case, is submissions to rules that may have led others to individuality. But to follow such rules, far from giving ourselves laws, is to obey the laws set down by another. They are at best an imitation of that other. But imitation destroys individuality. The undertaking of becoming an individual by following what somebody else has done is self-undermining. How to make a painting, how to write a short story, how to compose a sonata, even how to go about life in general. All that can be taught. All that can be taught in general terms and depends on rules that are, in fact, well established. Rules that constitute what it is to produce a recognizable work of art or a social role. But what cannot be so taught are what Nietzsche called the capricious rules that, according to Nietzsche, are responsible for, and for whose sake, rather, it is worthwhile to live on earth. But these rules, the rules that we are talking about now, always lie one step ahead of what anybody can tell us. Uniqueness and individuality require breaking some of the rules that already exist or inventing new ones, establishing a direction that couldn't possibly have been predicted beforehand. Innovation transcends prediction. On their own, however, neither breaking rules nor inventing them can by themselves affect the quality of what is produced. The intervention must be, as we say, creative, original, or justified in some other way. But again, creativity, originality, and justification can be no more specified in general terms than significance, unexpectedness, or for that matter, barbarity, as I was just saying. Paint a landscape tells you what to do, but you can follow the rules of painting a landscape and produce a monstrosity. Paint a beautiful landscape doesn't tell you what to do. It explains neither where I am to go nor how to get there. It is at best an inspirational slogan, not sound advice. Painting a landscape is a matter of choice. I can decide to do so and do it or not do it. Painting a beautiful landscape, though, is not a matter of choice. It's a matter of ability. And those two are very, very different. So suppose that I learn the basic principles of painting, but they're not enough for me. I want to be a great painter. I want to do better. So I ask my teacher how to paint a great picture. And my teacher first starts laughing at me and then holds up a late Rembrandt portrait and says, "That's how you make a great painting." Excellent advice. What am I to do? I'm to paint like Rembrandt. How to go about it? If I take the advice to be paint like Rembrandt, in other words, paint paintings that are like Rembrandt's, that are like Rembrandt's portrait, and the best way to do that, of course, is by copying it, I will certainly fail to produce a great picture. I will only make a copy. something that is, by definition, neither new nor valuable. Success requires that what I am to paint is a picture that is as good as Rembrandt's. That's what I want to accomplish. I might still have to copy his portrait and copy the portraits of other painters and learn from them. But what I do then is learn what those people have done to art so I can use it for my own purposes. Having gradually internalized what I learn from them, I might, if I'm talented, if I work hard, and if I'm very lucky, produce something worthwhile of my own. But if I do, my work, whatever else it may be, will also have to be significantly different from Rembrandt's painting. In ways, of course, that neither I nor anyone else could have possibly anticipated. The rules that I follow, so to speak, in order to make a painting that is as good as Rembrandt's are rules that can only be stated once I have accomplished what I was doing. My work must express my own features and abilities, just as Rembrandt's work expresses his own. It must differ, in other words, significantly from Rembrandt's work if it is to be comparable to it. That may have been what Michel de Montaigne had in mind when he described himself as a person who learns better by contrast than by example, and by flight rather than by pursuit. Only those works that are importantly different from Rembrandt's can survive comparison with his, because only they are, in the relevant sense, like his. One has to become different from one's models in order to imitate their accomplishment and produce work that is significant and admirable in its own right. But what will make my work significant and admirable is exactly what my teacher, and that's why he laughed at me, can't ever tell me. To paint like Rembrandt, when that refers to an accomplishment and not to the actual painting, an imitation, is precisely not to paint like him. So to paint like Rembrandt is not to paint like him, or to paint unlike him. And there's a nice paradox here, of which Nietzsche, of course, as usual, was perfectly aware. He has a little dialogue in a book of his called, excuse me, Imitators. So A says to B, what? You want no imitators? And B says, no, I do not want people to imitate my example. I want everyone to fashion their own example, just as I do. Now think about this, it's a very interesting paradox. One can be taught how to paint portraits, write novels, or make shoes, but not how to write good novels, paint significant portraits, or make excellent shoes. Such things, as Socrates intimates, may perhaps be learned, but they certainly cannot be taught. Art, including the art of living, can be taught. Good art, including the art of living, cannot. Philosophical individualism is incapable of giving general guidelines for how one should live. It admits that that is so and does not consider it a shortcoming. Montaigne, more than anyone else, makes that clear when he writes that I wish to make a show only of what is my own and of what is naturally my own. His own, that is, though it is based, and he admits that, on his having, I quote him, made a bunch of other people's flowers, having furnished nothing of my own but the thread to tie them. The thread, however, is what really counts. Philosophers like Montaigne and Nietzsche provide examples of admirable lives, but to imitate their example, just as in the arts, is to live a life that is distinctly our own. That is why I call them aestheticists. These philosophers stand out not only for the significance, depth, or even the truth of their views, of course, which is important and discussable, but also for the personalities that emerge from their work. The self-portrait that emerges from Montaigne's essays constitutes, the self-portrait Montaigne's essays constitute matters as much to philosophy as his theoretical positions. It matters not only what Montaigne believes, but who Montaigne is. And who Montaigne is matters, although it is neither desirable nor even possible for anyone else to be like him, a fact he knows and celebrates. What I write here, he tells us, is not my teaching, but my study. It is not a lesson for others, but for me. So, what sort of philosophy is it that aims, perhaps primarily, at providing instances of beautiful lives that are not and cannot be models for others to follow? What can it hope to accomplish? What is its point? Why do it? Here, too, the parallel with the arts is very helpful. As in the arts, we can admire a work without having to use a single work or artist as our standard for everything, so also in life. And as in the arts, every expansion of human possibility, every new manner of doing things, is a source of joy, so also in philosophy. George Eliot was right. At the end of Middlemarch, she writes, "The growing good of the world is dependent on unhistoric acts, and that things are not so ill with you and me as they might have been is half owing to the number who lived faithfully a hidden life and rest in unvisited tombs." We owe, indeed, deep respect to those nameless people, but the fact remains that they are nameless, and our respect and gratitude toward them are collective and impersonal. It takes nothing short of George Eliot to depict the life of someone like that and make it important. If, however, we admire, and we do, some features that make some people different from one another, if we value, and we do, not only the bonds that fit us together, but also the characteristics that make us stand apart, if we honor, and we do, the exceptional figures whom we commemorate in monuments either of ours or of their own devising, then philosophy, if we continue to think of it merely as an abstract discipline and a general description of the world, and limit its domain to the values of morality, as modern philosophy has generally done, then philosophy is doomed to pass by the sense and the value of life the same way that Odysseus's sailors, their ears blocked with wax, passed by the song of the sirens. Excuse me, just 1 minute, please. Now, here's a question. Does this approach to philosophy constitute an admirable life, or does it merely describe one? Did Nietzsche, who praises, all these various things that he praises and gives us, here's how one should live, does this life that Nietzsche described constitute a real possibility, or is it just a will-o'-the-wisp? And here's what some people would say, and something that I myself said at one point. Nietzsche himself, in his private life, we say, was a miserable little person. He was sick all the time, had no friends, nobody read him, nobody believed him, he couldn't hold a job or whatever. And so people say, here's a person who had great works but a terrible life. And I used to believe that too. But it was, I want to say now, a terrible mistake. Because the view that a philosopher's life, like Nietzsche's, was terrible, like the distinction between the life of somebody and the work of somebody, depends on taking the life to be everything that belongs to someone's biography except the work, as if the work is less important than the bills and the miseries and the everyday affairs of one's life. It is an even worse mistake if one applies it to somebody like Nietzsche or Montaigne, people for whom their work was the most important part of their life, and without which there would have been absolutely nothing. No, I want to say that the work is an integral part of the life. You cannot think of Nietzsche or Montaigne or anybody else's life if you exclude what it was that they achieved through it, their work. Another, and I'm closing soon, the last aesthetic dimension of philosophical individualism depends on its insistence that extra-moral values are crucial to the quality of human life. The values of morality, as I said, are based on our commonalities, actual or hoped for, and tend towards universality and impartiality. But they are not the only values there are. There are also values that rest on our differences from one another and are neither impartial nor universal. These values, most clearly found within the arts, aspire to distinction and individuality, and however deeply we admire a particular manifestation of them, we are under no obligation to accept them as our own. As E.M. Forster once wrote, "If I ever have to choose between betraying my friends and betraying my country, I hope I'll have the guts to betray my country." Just as, although I love Gaddafi and Proust and all kinds of other things, I don't believe that everyone else should love them as well, so I can admire a particular mode of life, like Nietzsche's, without wanting either myself or anyone else to live like him. We have neither an obligation nor a duty, the basic terms of morality, to live like those who have lived well, just as no one has the obligation to become an artist, and certainly not to become a great artist. If a life of morality is what you want, no one is going to stop you. If you have no interest at all in living well, that too is something no one can force you to do. The existence of those two kinds of value, however, makes it possible for them to clash. And when they do, when beauty and virtue conflict, I'm not at all certain that virtue, the values of morality, must always take precedence. Perhaps then, the effort to establish an original and individual approach to life has several features in common with the arts. But what about it makes it a distinctly philosophical project? Is it limited to figures like Socrates, Montaigne, and Nietzsche, or are Aeschylus, Rembrandt, and Proust also engaged in it? How, in fact, is a philosophical life different from any other activity, not just artistic, but also scientific, political, military, philanthropic, commercial, business, in any field whatsoever, that, when practiced successfully, might result in an admirable life? The answer is that a philosophic life revolves around two questions. First, what is a good life? And second, how can we engage in it? And the effort to answer those questions is itself an indispensable part of one's own way of living. When Socrates said that what mattered to him was how one should live, he introduced a conception of how one could live, a way of life whose goal, to live well, was to be reached through an examination of that very goal, the good life. It is primarily the reflective and self-referential character of Socrates' project, the mutual interpenetration of thought and action, that gives it its specifically philosophical character. Someone can always teach us what questions have been already asked and what answers they have received. And knowing them is necessary if one is to move beyond them. But no one can teach us how to incorporate them in our life and how sometimes we can create something admirable in the process. Thank you very much.